Most video games are just code, pixels, and somebody's imagination. But what if I told you that some of the most disturbing games ever made are not made up at all? What if I told you that one of these games shipped with a real shard of a poisoned coastline sealed inside the box, and another was quietly built around the unsolved murder of 4 children that the police never closed? Right now, we're stepping into the first level of the disturbing video games based on real events iceberg. We're talking about haunted mountains where real people died, horror games hiding real murders inside their code, and real horrors that someone turned into a level you actually play. Every game here points at something that genuinely happened, and the deeper we go, the thinner the line gets between the screen and the real world. Quick heads up before we start. Everything in this is drawn from public court records, news reporting, and academic sources. Nothing here is being celebrated. We're just walking through the history honestly. Let's start. Level 1. Kolat. If you've played Kolat, you probably remember the cold, the snow, and the voice guiding you through the mountains. What a lot of players don't realize is that the mountain is real, the names are real, and the 9 people who died there were real too. Kolat is built on the Dyatlov Pass incident. In February 1959, 9 experienced hikers set up camp on a slope in the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. Something happened that night that has never been fully explained. The hikers cut their way out of their own tent from the inside and ran into a blizzard, several of them barefoot or half-dressed, in temperatures far below freezing. All 9 were later found dead, scattered across the snow over a wide area. The condition of the bodies is what turned this into one of the most argued over mysteries of the last century. Some had fractured skulls and broken ribs with almost no external wounds. One of the women, found weeks after the others in a ravine, was missing her tongue and her eyes, though investigators have offered natural explanations for that since. For years, the official Soviet conclusion was that the group had been killed by an unknown compelling natural force, which is about as close to an official shrug as a government ever gives you. The game drops you onto that exact pass and asks you to retrace their final steps, and it leaves you holding the same question that pulled millions of people into this case in the first place. What were 9 trained survivors so frightened of that they cut their way out of their only shelter and ran into the freezing dark, knowing exactly what was waiting for them out there? Detention. On the surface, Detention looks like a moody, side-scrolling ghost story set in a Taiwanese school. Underneath the jump scares is a real stretch of history that the Taiwanese government spent decades trying to keep quiet. The game is set during what is known as the White Terror. After 1949, Taiwan lived under martial law for 38 years, one of the longest periods of martial law anywhere in the modern world. During that time, the government arrested, imprisoned, and executed people suspected of opposing it. Reading the wrong book or joining the wrong study group really could get a teenager pulled out of class. Historians estimate that somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people were executed, and well over 100,000 were imprisoned. In the game, the haunted school is full of students and teachers who were informed on, dragged away, and killed for reading banned literature. That part is not invented. Teachers really were arrested and executed for handing forbidden books to their students. And students really did inform on the people around them, sometimes to save themselves. The studio that made it, Red Candle Games, built the horror out of that exact fear. The ghosts in Detention are not really the monsters. The monster is the silence that came afterward, a whole generation that the state tried to erase from the official memory of the country. By the time you understand what the school actually is, the supernatural stuff stops being the scary part. The scary part is realizing how much of it was real, and how recently it ended. The Town of Light. The Town of Light is a first-person horror game where you play a woman named Renee returning to the asylum where she was once a patient. There are no monsters chasing you down the halls. The horror is that almost everything around you actually happened to real people. The asylum is a careful recreation of a real abandoned psychiatric hospital in Volterra, Italy. a place that finally closed its doors in 1978. The studio behind the game, an Italian team called LKA, walked the real ruins, studied the real architecture, and rebuilt it room by room. The graffiti, the layout, the long empty corridors, all of it is modeled on a place you can still find on a map. What happens to Renee is drawn from documented patient records and testimony, not invented for shock value. She's subjected to electroshock, restraint, and so-called treatments that were standard for decades. Across that era, real patients were drugged, sterilized, and locked away for things as small as depression, or for simply being an inconvenience to their families. People disappeared into places like Volterra and never came back out. The game makes you read the real history written into its walls, slowly, until you cannot separate Renee's story from the thousands of real ones it is stitched together from. And by the end, the scariest thought it leaves you with is a simple one. None of this ever needed a ghost. The building did all of it on its own, to real people, and most of their names are gone. This was only level 1 of our iceberg. So far, the real events are tragic, but at least they're out in the open, treated as history. As we go deeper, the games stop being honest about what they're based on, and the real crimes buried inside them get a lot darker. Stay with me, because by the bottom of this list, you're not just learning about an atrocity, you're being handed the controls to one. Level 2. Forbidden Siren. We're now on level 2, where the real horror stops being distant history and turns into something closer to murder. Forbidden Siren is a Japanese survival horror game famous for one terrifying image. The killers in the game strap glowing flashlights to their head as they hunt you through a cursed village in the dark. That image was not invented. The director Kiichiro Toyama has pointed to a real mass killing as part of the inspiration. In May 1938, in the rural Japanese village of Tsuyama, a young man cut the power to the entire area in the middle of the night. He then strapped 2 flashlights to his head, picked up a shotgun, a sword, and an axe, and moved from house to house while his neighbors slept. In a single night, 30 people lost their lives before he took his own at dawn. For a long time, it was one of the deadliest mass killings in modern Japanese history, and that flashlight-headed silhouette became infamous in Japanese true crime. The team behind Forbidden Siren built the look of their enemies around it. The game even gives its cursed village its own death toll, a slightly inflated echo of the real one, as if the developers wanted you to half recognize where it came from. So the thing shuffling toward you in the dark, that figure with lights bolted to its skull, is not a pure invention. It is a careful copy of a real man who really did walk through a real village, exactly like that, almost 90 years ago. The game just gave him somewhere to keep doing it. Hinter. Hinter is a small indie horror game that most people have never heard of. It puts you inside a quiet Bavarian farmhouse where something terrible is about to happen. The reason it sits so heavy is that the farmhouse, the family, and the killings are all taken from a real case that has never been solved. It is based on the Hinterkaifeck murders. On a farm in Bavaria in the spring of 1922, 6 people lost their lives, killed with a mattock, a kind of heavy pickaxe. The victims were the family who owned the farm and their 2 young children, along with a maid who had only just arrived. What makes the real case so unsettling is what happened in the days before. The family had found footprints in the snow leading toward the farm, but never away from it. They heard footsteps in the attic. The previous maid had quit, convinced the house was haunted. After the killings, investigators came to believe the murderer stayed in the house for several days. Someone fed the cattle. Someone ate in the kitchen. Smoke was seen rising from the chimney while the family lay dead in the barn and the house. Neighbors didn't realize anything was wrong for days, because from the outside, the farm looked like it was still running normally. The case was never solved. Decades of suspects, theories, and reinvestigations have led nowhere, and the farm itself was eventually torn down. There is more than one small game now built on this single farmhouse, and the reason is hard to argue with. The real story is somehow scarier than anything a writer would dare to make up, precisely because nobody ever got to write the ending. 9 Child Street. Nine Child Street looks like a fairly standard first-person horror game. You play a curious boy exploring an abandoned house full of strange, doll-like figures. It feels made up, right up until you learn it is built on one of the most disturbing real cases ever to come out of Russia. The game draws on the crimes of a man arrested in the city of Nizhny Novgorod in 2011. On paper, he was a respected historian, a local expert on cemeteries, the kind of quiet academic nobody looks twice at. In reality, police discovered that he had spent years taking the bodies of young women and girls from their graves. He brought them home and, as hard as it is to picture, kept them as life-size dolls, giving them names and treating them as if they were part of his family. When investigators searched his home, they found the remains of around 24 victims. In his own mind, he seems to have believed he was looking after them, not desecrating them, which is somehow worse than if he had simply been cruel. The game takes that exact nightmare, a home quietly filled with dead treated as decorations, and lets you wander through it at your own pace. The studio has been open about the real inspiration, and the reason it gets under your skin is not the jump scares. It's that you already half know, the whole time you're exploring, that a version of every room around you genuinely existed, and that someone lived inside it for years without anyone noticing. Crime Detective Red Flags. This one is a small, rough indie game that almost nobody has played, and that's exactly why it belongs here. Crime Detective Red Flags casts you as a man under house arrest, watching his neighbors through the windows. The case underneath it is a real unsolved nightmare that still has no ending. The game is openly based on the Oakland County child killer. Between early 1976 and 1977, in the suburbs of North Detroit, 4 children were taken and later found dead. Whoever took them held them for days at a time. And here is the detail that has haunted investigators for almost 50 years. The children appeared to have been cleaned and cared for before they died, their clothes washed, as if someone had been keeping them comfortable right up until the end. Despite one of the largest investigations in Michigan history, with tens of thousands of tips, the killer was never caught. The case is still technically open today. Several suspects have come and gone over the decades, but no one has ever been charged, and the families have spent the rest of their lives with no answer. The game itself is buggy and obscure, the kind of thing you stumble onto by accident. But it is directly pointing at a real predator who chose ordinary suburban children, kept them, cared for them, and then left them where they would be found. As far as anyone knows, that person grew old and died like everyone else, somewhere in Michigan, never once having to answer for any of it. So who were they? And how does someone do that to 4 children and then simply stop? Level 3. Firework. We're entering Level 3, and here the games stop pointing at single killers and start pointing at entire systems of real-world harm. Firework is a Chinese horror game that became a quiet sensation in its home country. It looks like a ghost story set in a remote mountain village. It's really about things that happen in the real countryside. Underneath the supernatural surface, Firework deals with the dark side of life in some isolated rural communities. The way vulnerable people, especially young girls, were failed or exploited, and the way superstition was used to paper over it. In parts of the real countryside, daughters were sometimes treated as burdens to be quietly gotten rid of, and a convenient ghost story was often easier to tell than the truth. The game wraps those facts inside a folk horror plot so that, by the end, you realize the real monster was never a spirit at all. What makes it land so hard for Chinese players is that it's not exaggerating for effect. The exploitation of children and the pressure that falls on families with unwanted daughters are documented, ongoing problems, not historical footnotes. The ghost is just the shape the game gives to a grief that a lot of real families have actually lived through, and were never allowed to talk openly about. It's a horror game where the scariest element is how little it had to invent. Strip away the folk horror imagery, and what's left is a quiet, accurate portrait of how a society can lose its own children and then agree collectively to look the other way. The spirits are almost a mercy. They give the real horror somewhere to hide. Paper Bride. Paper Bride is a folk horror series that turns one of China's strangest real customs into a nightmare. In the game, you find yourself caught up in a so-called ghost wedding, haunted by a bride who keeps appearing and vanishing. That custom is real, and the crimes that grew out of it are very real too. The practice is called mingun, or ghost marriage. In some rural areas, when a man dies unmarried, his family may try to find the body of a dead woman to marry him to, so that he's not alone in the afterlife. The two are then buried together. For most of its long history, this was simply folklore, a way of grieving. The disturbing part is what modern demand did to it. Because some families will pay real money for a female corpse, a black market grew up around the custom. There are documented cases of grave-robbing rings digging up women's bodies to sell, and far darker cases of men who murdered women specifically so they could sell the bodies as ghost brides. In one widely reported case, a man killed several victims to feed exactly that trade. Paper Bride takes that real economy, the quiet buying and selling of dead women, and builds its haunting on top of it. The vanishing bride and the cursed weddings are just the supernatural wrapping. Underneath is a real market in human bodies, one that still turns up in the news every few years. And that's the part that follows you out of the game. Saseng. Saseng is a Korean first-person horror game where you play a famous idol being hunted inside your own home. There's no demon and no curse. The thing stalking you is a fan, and that is pulled straight from a real and well-documented part of K-pop culture. The word saseng describes obsessive fans who cross every line that exists. This is not a vague, exaggerated fear. Real idols have had stalkers break into their apartments, install hidden cameras, track their flights, memorize their schedules, and turn up at their family homes. Some have received disturbing personal gifts. In one infamous real incident, a performer was handed a drink that had been tampered with by a fan. Several artists have spoken openly about living in genuine fear of the people who claim to love them the most. The game puts you on the receiving end of all of it. You are trapped in your own space, while someone who knows your habits, your routines, and your address slowly closes the distance. There is no fighting back in any meaningful way. You can only hide, listen, and wait. The same options a lot of real idols have described being left with. It works as horror because it barely has to invent anything. The developers didn't need to dream up a monster. They just took the documented behavior of real stalkers and put a controller in your hand. For a lot of performers, the experience the game simulates is not a nightmare scenario. It's a fairly accurate description of an ordinary week. Level 4. This War of Mine. We've reached level 4, where the games stop recreating a single crime and start handing you an entire catastrophe to live inside. Most war games give you a rifle and turn you into the hero. This War of Mine does the exact opposite, and it does it on purpose, because it is based on a real siege, where the survivors were never soldiers at all. The game draws directly from the Siege of Sarajevo, which ran from 1992 to 1996 and lasted nearly 1,400 days, making it the longest siege of a capital city in modern warfare. For almost 4 years, ordinary civilians were trapped in a city ringed by snipers and artillery, with no reliable food, water, electricity, or heat. People burned their own furniture to stay warm and risked their lives sprinting across intersections where snipers were known to be waiting. In the game, you do not command a special forces squad. You control a small group of regular people hiding in a bombed-out house, trying to live one more night. The studio, an outfit called 11-Bit, built the game on real survivor diaries and accounts from people who actually lived through a siege like this one. The impossible choices it forces on you came straight from those testimonies. And those choices are the real weapon the game uses. At some point, it will ask whether you are willing to steal medicine or food from people even weaker than you, an elderly couple, a frightened neighbor, so that your own group can survive. There is no clean answer, and the game refuses to give you one. It's actually one of the only games that makes you feel the real cost of a war from the side of it that history usually forgets entirely. 6 Days in Fallujah. Few games have a history as ugly as 6 Days in Fallujah. It was built to recreate a specific, real, and very recent battle, and the backlash nearly killed it before it ever reached players. The game is based on the Second Battle of Fallujah, fought in Iraq in November 2004. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the entire Iraq War, with heavy losses among soldiers and civilians, and brutal house-to-house fighting that flattened much of the city. The original studio, Atomic Games, worked directly with real Marines who had been there, using their accounts to recreate actual streets and actual operations. When it was first announced in 2009, families of the dead and many veterans were horrified at the idea of turning a battle that had just killed thousands of people into entertainment. The publisher, Konami, pulled out under the pressure, and the game vanished for more than a decade, written off as too tasteless to exist. Then it came back. A new team revived it and finally released it into early access years later, still trialing the same controversy it started with. And it never really escaped the one question it was born under. How much time has to pass before a real battle, with real names on real headstones, becomes something a stranger is allowed to load up and play for fun on a quiet afternoon? Hush. Hush is short, simple, and one of the most quietly devastating games on this entire list. It was made as a student project. It only lasts a few minutes, and it's about the Rwandan genocide. In 1994, over roughly 100 days, hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives in Rwanda as militias hunted down members of an ethnic minority across the whole country. Families were killed in their homes, in churches, in the streets when they tried to run. It remains one of the fastest and most horrifying genocides of the modern era, and it happened while the rest of the world mostly watched. The game puts you in the position of a mother hiding with her baby, while killers move through the area just outside. The way you play is almost unbearable. You have to type out the words of a lullaby in rhythm to keep the baby calm and quiet. If you mistime the keys, the baby starts to cry, and the danger outside hears it. In just a few minutes, with almost no graphics and no action, the game makes you feel a sliver of an impossible real choice that real mothers actually face during those 100 days. It doesn't lecture you, it just hands you a lullaby and the silence around it, and lets you understand in your own hands how thin the line was between staying quiet and not surviving the night. Level 5. Disaster Report 4. We are now on level 5, where the real world didn't just inspire these games. In a couple of cases, it reached out and destroyed them. Disaster Report 4 is the eeriest example of that. The Disaster Report series is built around surviving natural disasters, especially earthquakes. The fourth game was completely finished and scheduled to release in Japan in March 2011. Then, just days before it was supposed to come out, a massive real earthquake struck off the coast of Japan and triggered a tsunami that took somewhere around 18 to 19,000 lives. Releasing a game about surviving an earthquake days after a real one had just devastated the country was impossible. It was cancelled almost immediately, on the 14th of March. Pulled so completely, it was as if it had never been made. For years, it simply sat there. A finished product that no one was allowed to play, because the disaster it simulated had just happened for real, on the news, to real families. It was eventually revived and released years later by a different studio, quietly, once enough time had passed. But the original cancellation remains one of the strangest collisions between reality and a game ever recorded. The team did nothing wrong. They built a careful, respectful survival game, and the real world picked the worst possible week to prove their subject matter was not hypothetical at all. Gwangju Mod. This one is a fan-made modification for a war game, and it was taken down after a real government and the people of an entire city objected to it. The reason is that it recreated a real massacre, and it framed that massacre as a lie. The mod was built on a popular medieval war game and based on the Gwangju Uprising of 1980 in South Korea. Pro-democracy protesters, many of them students, rose up against the military government, and the army responded by opening fire on its own citizens. Many people lost their lives, and for decades, the survivors fought simply to have the massacre officially acknowledged as what it was. The disturbing part was the framing. Instead of treating the victims as victims, the mod leaned into a real strain of historical revisionism, the kind that paints the murdered civilians as armed rioters who brought it on themselves, and casts the general behind the killings in a heroic light. It took a real atrocity and quietly flipped who the villain was. After complaints, South Korea's game ratings board got involved. The storefront moved to block it in the country, and the mod's own creator ended up pulling it down. Reports disagree on exactly how widely it was removed, but the outcome was the same. A real event that people had died fighting to have remembered honestly was, for a brief moment, rewritten as propaganda inside a game, and then erased again. Level 6. Waco Resurrection. We've reached level 6, and the games here do something far more uncomfortable than recreating a tragedy. They put you in the role of the person who caused it. Waco Resurrection is an art game built around one of the most infamous standoffs in American history. In 1993, federal agents laid siege to the compound of a religious group near Waco, Texas, led by a man who claimed to be a final prophet. The standoff lasted 51 days and ended when the compound caught fire. Around 76 people lost their lives inside, including many children, in a disaster that the country argued about for years afterward. The game's idea is deliberately provocative. Each player takes on the role of the leader himself, even wearing a sculpted plastic version of his face, and chants his real sermons aloud while defending the compound against the coming assault. It was made by an art collective in the early 2000s as a piece meant to force a conversation about belief, media, and violence, not as a power fantasy. That hasn't stopped it from being deeply divisive. A real survivor of the siege condemned the project, pointing out the obvious thing that an art statement can lose sight of. What happened at Waco was not a performance and not a game. Real people, including children, really died in that fire, and turning the man at the center of it into a character you operate sits uneasily no matter how serious the intentions behind it were. Kamikuishiki Village. This is one of the rarest and strangest games on the entire list, made in Japan and almost impossible to find today. It's named after a real village, and it lets you step into the shoes of the leader of a real doomsday cult in the months around a real terror attack. It's tied to the cult behind the Tokyo subway sarin attack of 1995. On a single morning in March that year, members of that cult released a deadly nerve agent on crowded subway trains during rush hour. 13 people lost their lives and thousands more were injured in one of the worst attacks in modern Japanese history. The game only appeared a few months later, casting the player as the cult's leader, managing the group from their compound. Now here's the part that flips the whole thing. For years, the game itself was wrapped in a rumor that the cult had made it as propaganda. Researchers who have actually dug into it argue the opposite. It was made by outsiders as savage satire, mocking the leader and the group at a moment when the country was still in shock, closer to a cruel political cartoon than a recruitment tool. So it sits in a genuinely strange place, a game that asked players to inhabit a man who had just carried out one of the worst attacks in the country's history, released while the wounds were still fresh, that most people assumed was made by monsters and was actually made by people furious at them. It's one of the most uncomfortable artifacts the medium has ever produced, and it leaves you with a question nobody has really ever settled. Is that protest, or is it just cruelty wearing the mask of satire? The Church in the Darkness. The Church in the Darkness is the most polished, widely available game on this level, and it's built on one of the largest single losses of American civilian life in modern history. You play someone sneaking into a remote jungle settlement run by a charismatic preacher, and the whole thing is modeled on a real cult. The clear inspiration is the People's Temple and the events at Jonestown in 1978. A charismatic leader moved hundreds of his followers from the United States to an isolated compound in the jungle of Guyana, promising them a paradise away from a world he said was out to destroy them. When the outside world finally came to investigate, it ended in a mass murder-suicide. More than 900 people lost their lives, many of them poisoned, including around 300 children. The game is careful not to copy it one-to-one. It randomizes the details each time you play, So the leaders, their beliefs, and their ending all shift, and the names are changed. But the shadow over all of it is unmistakably Jonestown. In some playthroughs, you arrive to find the congregation has already died, and you're simply walking through the aftermath of a choice that was made before you got there. What it captures, better than a straight retelling could, is the slow slide. It takes the real, sickening arc of a community walking willingly toward its own destruction, one reasonable-sounding step at a time, and lets you feel how quickly a promised paradise can curdle into a grave, with hundreds of people following right up until the end. Level 7. On the Rocks. We've reached the deepest level, and the first thing waiting here sounds almost absurd, until you find out what was physically sealed inside the box. On the Rocks is an obscure game about a real environmental catastrophe, and it's shipped with a piece of the actual disaster inside it. It was based on the Exxon Valdez oil spill of 1989, when a tanker ran aground off the coast of Alaska and released millions of gallons of crude oil into the water. The spill devastated the coastline and killed enormous numbers of seabirds, otters, and fish, and the cleanup dragged on for years. The man who made the game was a local bartender who had personally worked that cleanup, scrubbing oil off the rocks of the shoreline by hand. Here is the detail that makes it impossible to forget. According to records of the project, each copy of the game shipped with a real rock, taken from the contaminated shoreline, still coated in oil from the spill. So whoever bought it was not just simulating the cleanup of a real disaster. They were holding a genuine poisoned fragment of it in their hands, in their living room, years after the tanker went down. Almost nobody has heard of it, and it's barely a video game in the modern sense at all. But that strange physical piece of a real catastrophe, mailed out to strangers as part of the game, is exactly why it earns a spot this far down. Most games point at a real event from a safe distance. This one put a literal piece of one on your coffee table. Cave Crave, Nutty Putty. This is one of the most recent games here, and it might be the most uncomfortable, because it invites you back into a place that was permanently sealed with a real man's body still inside it. It's based on the death of a caver in Nutty Putty Cave in Utah in 2009. While exploring a tight section of the cave, a 26-year-old man slid headfirst into an extremely narrow passage and became trapped upside down. Rescuers worked for more than a day to free him, in agonizing conditions, but it proved impossible and he died there, inverted in the dark. The decision was eventually made not to recover his body. The cave was sealed shut with concrete, turning the whole site into his grave. The game rebuilds that exact cave in virtual reality using the real layout and lets players crawl back through the same passages. To their credit, the developers block off the precise spot where he died and added a mode where you cannot get stuck or die. They were clearly trying to handle it with some care, but the core idea stays divisive no matter how carefully it's done. You're being invited as entertainment to crawl back into a real tomb through the real geometry that killed a real person, in a place the real world looked at and decided no one should ever enter again. The game gives you a way back in that the family was specifically denied. When it reaches the children. Right near the bottom, the pattern takes its darkest turn. It's not just lone developers making these things on the fringes of the internet. Some of the most disturbing real event recreations have shown up on platforms built for children. On one of the world's biggest gaming platforms used for kids, users have repeatedly built real atrocities as playable experiences. Recreations of a real mosque shooting and of a real attack on a youth summer camp have both been found there, sitting in a library aimed at children, until they were reported and pulled. Each time the platform removes them, and each time more quietly take their place. The horror here is not one clever game with a hidden meaning. It's how casually a real mass killing can be rebuilt as a toy, dropped into a children's storefront, and played for a while before anyone notices. It's the same impulse behind every game on this list, the urge to turn a real horror into something you can play, except stripped of any art, any apology, or any point, and aimed straight at the youngest audience there is. Where the real ends and the legend begins. There is one last thing waiting at the very bottom. And it might be the most important. Because for every game on this list that is genuinely tied to a real event, the internet has invented dozens more that are not, and learning to tell them apart is its own kind of horror. Take Polybius. For decades, people have sworn that a strange arcade machine quietly appeared in Portland in the early 80s, that it gave players blackouts, seizures, and waking nightmares, and that men in suits would show up after hours to collect the data it was harvesting from them. It's a genuinely unsettling story. It's also completely made up. No such machine has ever been found, no player was ever harmed by it, and every attempt to trace it back to a real cabinet dead ends in the same place. A rumor that simply got too good to die. Or take the times a real crime gets pinned on some old horror game, just because the game happened to be found on the suspect's computer, even when it had nothing to do with what they actually did. That is the trap this whole genre sets. Real tragedies get buried under invented ones, until people genuinely can't tell which horrors actually happened and which were stitched together for clicks. So if there is one thing to carry away from the bottom of this iceberg, it's this. The real events are disturbing enough on their own. They do not need the legends, and the real people inside them deserve to be remembered as what they actually were, not as creepypasta. Looking back at all of these, the strangest part is how often the truth was sitting right underneath something we assumed was just entertainment. A mountain where 9 real people died. A lullaby you type to keep a baby quiet during a real genocide. A box with a real poisoned rock sealed inside it. I'm genuinely curious to know which one is going to stay with you tonight. Was it the flashlight strapped to a real killer's head in 1938? Or the cave that was sealed shut with someone still inside it? Drop it in the comments, because I read every single one. If you made it this far and you want more of these, hit subscribe and I'll see you at the bottom of the next one. Take care of yourself.